to Botswana and Zimbabwe in our Africa regions, as well as our global partners. So I see that we do have some global attendance today, which is really fantastic. And then also, what's really great is that our members in the regions have been able to join us online, just to look at this topic of what is the emerging risk culture in Africa. And so we'll be taking you through the session, but before we actually kick off, just a couple of house rules. And so you'll see on your Zoom platform, you are able to actually chat with your colleagues online. So please just make use of that chat box. And you would have seen that the IRMSA team is already welcoming you and trying to give you that sense of being in a physical event. And we really miss that physical interaction. So please just network as you would. And then there's also a Q&A button. So if you, during the session, if you really just want to give comments or ask a question, we'll be doing that on the back end of the session. So just feel free to post your comments and post your questions, and we will take those questions towards the end of the session. But before we get into that, really just want to talk about what we're doing in that IRMSA space. And for those members who have joined us, you know IRMSA well. For the non-members and our stakeholders in the room, the Institute of Risk Management South Africa, we really just concentrate on that strategy, risk and resilience space. And so the leading source of information and really just driving that agenda. And what we do in the Africa regions is we really are fortunate to have an Africa steering committee of volunteers that that have networks in the Africa regions and are able to assist us with really looking at what do we do in the regions. And so if you are actually sitting in those Africa regions and you're looking at additional resources, we really do have a lot of resources in our technical library that you can access. And so reach out to us either via the chat function or Roxanne, who's hosting the session, will actually pop through an email address where you can actually engage with us and really just ask those questions. So what are we doing at IRMSA? So this year, our theme for the year, so we always choose a theme for the year to really just bring in all of those initiatives and weave that golden thread of what are we doing at IRMSA in the year. So really exciting theme, and you will see that my virtual background is actually our theme for the year, which is step up, now is the time. And I think as risk managers and risk practitioners and business leaders, we've really had to step up in the last year, where risk management has actually just been catapulted into that spotlight. And what do we do? How do we adapt? How are we agile? And how do we just adapt so that we are resilient in our organizations in this really uncertain landscape? And so we'll be talking about that today, and what are those emerging, what is that emerging risk culture, and some really great insights coming through. So happening in the IRMSA space, you would see we share loads of information with you. In the education space, we've got our board exams coming up. And so IRMSA has 2 designations that is listed with the South African Qualifications Authority. And so if you are looking to follow that career path, our CRM professional, which is board exam 2, our registrations close on the 2nd of July. So chat to our professionalization team. Portia Sangrini is actually sitting in the session. So if you want to reach out and chat to her about the board exams and looking at that professionalization designation, there is an easier way to get there in terms of applying for exemption. So if you are at that level where you qualify to apply for exemption, chat to our team and see how you can actually do that, and what are the benefits of actually getting that designation. And then our board exam 1, which gives you the CRM practitioner designation, closes on the 9th of July. So just chat to our team. In terms of our training solutions, our digital platforms have allowed us to really just expand to meet our members in the regions where we are offering online training and really just interactive training online. So Roxanne will post those links in the chat function so that you can actually explore what are the courses and what are the resources that are available to you. And then I think what's also important to note is that any of those courses can actually be tailored so that we can actually come into your organization and do company specific training. So if you're sitting in your teams and looking at what skills do you need in your teams, reach out to us to see how we can actually tailor-make training so that you are able to achieve your objectives in your organization. And then, of course, our e-learning platform, which is training on demand, and we have a few of our most popular courses in that risk space to just empower you and to make an impact. So if you are that busy professional, then that e-learning solution really just works because you can just fit it into your lifestyle. And then looking at our membership for the year, so you would have received lots of information from our membership department to look at how do you renew your membership, and then what is the value of that IRMSA membership, and what do you as a member get access to in terms of your IRMSA membership. And if you are non-member sitting in the session, you can actually just click on those links and really just reach out to our team to look at how you can get involved and how you can participate in that space. Our events, you would have noticed that we are hosting loads of webinars on our online platforms and looking at this really uncertain landscape. And as much as we'd love to meet you in person, we are doing everything digitally just to ensure that we keep you safe and that we really just get over this pandemic that we in this current landscape. An exciting webinar that's coming up, which is a free webinar that we're offering in terms of our Protection of Personal Information Act, which comes into play on the 1st of June, 1st of July. So we are hosting an information session on what does that Protection of Information, Personal Information Act mean for you as an individual and as an organization, and what do you need to be doing to be compliant. So on the 8th of June, we're hosting that webinar, which is really just an information sharing session. So I hope you just join that session to hear more about that. And then for our chief risk officers, we have a chief risk officers forum coming up on the 30th of June. And that invitation would be in your inboxes, and really just looking at that high level, what keeps risk officers awake at night. And so before I continue, and I'm giving you loads of information, but a lot of it will be in the chat function. It is my absolute privilege to start the session off and to introduce you to Millicent Mashimate, who will be our facilitator today. And Millicent really is a professional, and we know Millicent really well in the IRMSA space. She sits on our Limpopo IRMSA Regional Committee, amongst other committees in her space. Most recently, since November last year, Millicent has joined as a Director of Internal Audit at the University of South Africa, and previously Chief Risk Officer at Lepella Northern Water. She has over 10 years experience in the risk management space and internal audit. So Millicent, over to you to kick off the session and to facilitate. So welcome.
Okay, thank you so much, Val, and good morning to you and all colleagues in the session. Thank you for that warm welcome to this prestigious IRMSA webinar. I am sure that all the participants are feeling welcomed and eager to start with the main purpose of the day. And colleagues, thank you so much, Val. So colleagues, we are meeting at a time when, as an African continent, which is the same as the rest of the world, are battling with the COVID-19 pandemic. A pandemic that literally changed the status quo in risk management and in businesses as a whole. With it, we've seen senior management of entities, oversight committees, as well as board of directors of companies, literally finding interest in risk management and what risk management has to offer, more especially now that they're interested more to know what may go wrong, like what is emerging in the, be it in the industry or wherever else. So with that said, I think also Valerie has made mention now of the IRMSA theme, which is to step up, and now is the time, and it's literally the time that we as risk professionals need to step up, because now the need is even more. And we've always complained about that recognition in our institutions where risk management was, taken at the back seat, where you expected to do risk registers and not necessarily the strategic level type of engagement and coming up with the emerging risks on a continuous basis and saying, in terms of our strategic objectives, this is what may happen for us not to achieve our objectives. So colleagues, to give us more insight about the emerging risk culture in or within the African continent, we have a highly skilled and knowledgeable expert within the risk management fraternity. And this colleague has over 28 years experience spread across internal audit, risk management, forensic security, and business continuity. And he's also held senior management roles across various industries in his close to 3 decades spanning career. He currently serves as a chief risk officer for Lucara, Botswana, and currently colleagues, I'm going to also just before I call on to our guest, emphasize on the house rules that Valerie has already touched on, and that is, if you have questions, please make sure that you put them on the chat box. We will allow our speaker to speak for or present, and only after the presentation we'll then look at the questions. So please put your questions there. I'm going to be noting them, and at the end of the presentation we'll then engage on that. So ladies and gentlemen and colleagues, please help me welcome to our virtual stage Mr. Jonathan Leroux. Jonathan, please join us, and the stage is yours for the next 25 minutes.
Great, thanks, Melissa, and thanks for the introduction. I'm not so sure whether I'm classified as an expert, but I'll definitely attempt to share some insights and experience from my perspective.
Okay,
so let me just get up my presentation here quickly.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so hopefully all of you can see the presentation in front of you. So maybe if you want to just confirm that you can all see the presentation.
Thanks, Jonathan. I can see it from my side, and I hope all other colleagues can. So I think we can start. Thank you.
Okay, no, great.
Yes, I see from the chat that yes, they can see. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, so today is really around giving you a perspective in time, specifically from where I'm sitting as the CRO for Lucara Botswana over the last, I would almost say, kind of 16, 18 months, but obviously looking specifically around last year. So I'm giving you a perspective as to where I'm operating from. So let's just hopefully, there we go. So I'm going to kind of touch base on 4 key aspects today, really around just defining risk culture to you. at least from what the definition is, and then ultimately what the way I see it. I'm going to talk to you a little bit around what are those emerging risks that we saw from the kind of the seat here in Botswana. Then go into what are those mitigation considerations we apply to those particular risks, and then really around just, a lot of the question is around how Africa adapts to emerging risks. So I can only really give a perspective from the mining company I work for, and ultimately aspects of Botswana, but I can't comment on Africa holistically. There's other delegates on this particular webinar that can give a view from Namibia and other surrounding countries around Botswana. So I'm going to just give a view of that. So hopefully that just helps with some of the context around that. So jumping into risk culture, I think the important thing is, and I think was mentioned earlier this morning by the chairperson, in terms of around the importance around agility in terms of what we do. And I always like this quote because it's always around, the focus here is around learning. And I know all of you can read, but I always, like to look at this and say, ultimately we have individuals that are well-versed, well-experienced, but because the environment in the world has moved on, they potentially find themselves perfectly suited for a world that no longer exists. So the critical part around what we're talking about is the ability to continually learn. And even in some instances, you have to unlearn some habits that have established in your space as an individual, maybe as even a department or a division, and even potentially even as an organization. So the critical thing is around how do we continually ensure that as the world is changing, and last year is no different to the change that people are going through, how do you adapt to that? Otherwise, you're just not going to be prepared. So I wanted to make sure, are we continually thinking around that particular part, around how do we continually learn new things, be exposed to different stuff? We might not always understand it, but how do we move forward from there? So yeah, some nice little definitions around risk culture and what they're all about. And if I look at all of these, there's some nice reference to, this collective ability to identify and understand, openly and discuss and act on organizations' risks. It talks about awareness, it talks about risk taking and commitment to the style of risk management. And I always like to look, you can take all of these and you can apply it to your organization, but if you look at the top line, really around culture is the way we do things, and risk culture is no different. And the question I always say, I know that sometimes we'd like to believe as risk practitioners or professionals that, because of us, that the world's a better place. And I always say that the true testimony to whether your risk culture is embedded in the organization is, what are those risk conversations, what are those risk dialogues that occur when you are not there? Because to me, that is the evidence that what you're doing is actually permeating throughout the organization. And I suppose for me, sitting here, over the last 12, 18 months, almost 2 years now, in terms of when we started with truly embedding the risk management culture and frameworks and policies, is to me, when I look at conversations that happen in other meetings that are not necessarily risk focused. So yes, we have our risk register meetings and I sit with the risk champions and heads of departments. But to me, when I look at other meetings that are not risk orientated, so example here at Lucara Botswana, we have an example like, let's say, manpower meetings, so HR or human capital meetings. We have cost and performance review meetings. We have CapEx and OpEx meetings. And when you're finding in those meetings, there's a dedicated focus and culture and dialogue around risk that's coming through. So it's not that I've told the heads of departments, you need to add this risk slide to your conversations. They are, as part of their presentations around cost and performance, they are bringing in their risk registers or their risk concerns into that conversation. So to me, that's really, in terms of risk culture, for me, is around what discussions take place on risk when you are not there. And if those risk conversations are rich and they are evolving and they are value adding, then you know that what you've started in terms of your discussion is starting to permeate throughout the organization. Because the ultimate objective for you is around building that culture that basically continues whether you are there or not. So to me, I think that's an important thing for us to always, be mindful of. So I thought I'd just leave you with that as a starting point. Also, what we have to understand is when we look at a risk culture and whether it's been embedded or not, there's two parts, and I'm showing you here what the ideal is in terms of risk culture, is that that there's this continuous view that there's going to be change. So there's a maturity around individuals within the organization. So they know that continually, a process is changing, or a procedure of the organization, or, the DNA of the organization is changing, so that I should be evolving with it. So that's really important. There's a very strong commitment to the purpose and the values and the ethics of the organization. There's responsibility that's, not just at an organizational level or departmental level, but at an individual level. So it's the same here, on the mine side, we talk around various, what we refer to as shared responsibilities. So we talk around SHE, safety, health, and environment. We talk around SHE is a shared responsibility. We talk about security being a shared responsibility. So it's kind of like when you're walking on the mine and you see something that could be a hazard or an area of risk or a tripping point or a near miss. It's not around saying, well, this is not my responsibility to bring this to anybody's attention. I'll wait for SHE or security. The view here is very strong around if you see something that does not look right or is a concern which may bring danger to somebody else, you bring it to the immediate attention of that individual, and then you escalate it through the normal channels. So I think that's really, really important on where does that responsibility lie? Because if you're the driver of the risk culture as a risk practitioner or a director of risk or audits, the challenge with that is that if you're not there, it falls apart. So how do you create what I always refer to as those champions in the business that you can rely on as your ally, to drive it further? The organization has to be a learning one. That's really, really important. If you don't have this continuous learning process, you're also dead in the water. I think IRMSA has already demonstrated in terms of lots of their programs and courses that there's resources available on that side. Also, how is the risk being considered at a tactical level, at an operational level, and at a strategic level? So we have to look at things holistically, and also around communication. How often does the communication come through? Is it done only on a quarterly basis? Are people, upfront and honest around, the things are not looking good here. I'm concerned around this, I'm concerned around that. So I think that's really, really important. And also understanding the value of effective risk management. So risk management is a continuous process, and we have to be thinking around that on a continuous basis. So hopefully that's the ideal that you're looking for. But it's also to understand that if this is the ideal risk culture that you're looking for, what do you currently look like? Because it's kind of like, if you don't know what you look like, how do you know where you're going, and how do you know whether you can kind of measure and monitor that risk culture that should be embedded? So I've just listed, there might be different terminology that you use in your own organization, but for me, there's really 5, I suppose, types of risk management maturity. There's those individuals who are what I refer to as almost clueless. They're not aware of really what's going on in the organization. And that might be those with very low maturity, maybe startups, maybe they don't have the governance in place. So it could be early stages of development, almost very, very early beginnings of organizations or businesses. Then we have siloed or fragmented organizations in terms of risk management. It only happens in one department, only in a particular way. They don't speak to each other, so it's not connected. Then the third one's really around top down. So we have a very strong, this is how we're going to do it, and it's driven top down. And then systematic is now we're getting to have a better hybrid, a better connectedness around the different departments. There's probably a combination of top down and bottom up, and there's greater synergies. And then ultimately the pinnacle is around moving to that risk intelligence side of it. So looking at those black swans, those other things that are maybe not in the main of what you're doing. So to me, when you're looking at a risk culture, you also have to understand what is your risk maturity, because you might be thinking that your risk culture should be like this, but if you don't understand where you are from a risk management maturity perspective, you have a disconnect, and you may be expecting more than where you actually are. So you have to be fully conversant as to where you find yourself And I think these two need to be dealt with, collectively and not as separate issues. So that's really around just talking a little bit around the, the risk culture, and hopefully just, lets you think around some of the things that, hopefully maybe in your space at the moment, or things that might help you to realize that maybe you've had some resistance to some of the things where you are, and go back to your maturity model. Where are you? What is the risk culture? Also understand the DNA of the organization. Some things that we don't think around from organizations is, how we structured from a people perspective. When I talk about people perspective, I'm talking about makeup of your people in terms of, are they baby boomers, generation X, generation Y, the born frees, the millennials, because culture is different across all of those, and how you are engaging with those individuals will be very, very different. So when I'm speaking to staff at potentially a junior level here, I need to be relating stuff to their task, where they are, and it has to be relevant to them from a millennial perspective. So it's around quick information, short bites, short and sharp. Don't go too high level. You're going to lose individuals. As you move up, you give a bit more information. Maybe it's not face to face. Maybe it's a presentation. So you have to leverage technology. So you have to have multiple, media ways to engage with people. So hopefully this gives you some sense to that. In terms of the emerging risks for us in 2020, I'll get into that now, but ultimately the key thing is that I like bringing in some quotes, is that, if you want to look at the future and where you're going, a lot of it is not going to be based on yesterday's logic. So you have to be, even your successes as an organization, what made you really successful last year is not a guarantee for future. So how do you continually, tweak those areas you're in, look at new avenues, and often those new insights do not come from your industry. It could be coming from a totally different industry, totally not even close to where you are. So it's very important to continue to do research, to find out what are those other avenues that are available. So in terms of from where we're sitting as a mining operation, we look at various sources. This is just one source that is a reference point for us. The top 10 business risks across the energy, the mining and metals side of it. And the big thing for us as an organization is obviously around our license to operate. So anything that would impact our license to operate would prevent us from doing business. So for obviously the Botswana government, the Botswana Chamber of Mines, they are the ones that govern what we do and how we do it. And it's all linked to various legislation and regulation, et cetera, et cetera. So license to operate is really, really critical. So these are the ones that we look at as a reference point amongst other sources. If you look at this in terms of 2021 and even 2020, that number 2 risk, their high impact risk, that particular one is where COVID came into play across the board. And you'll see as you go up the other risks, you see that innovation, digital and data, volatility, all of those are potentially important. But a lot of them have actually reduced in terms of where we found ourselves last year. So that's in the key thing for you, wherever you're sitting in your space. What are your top risks? What are your sources that you have? Whether it's professional services firm like EY, or whether it's the World Economic Forum, you need to have various sources to have a reference point for you. So you're not just speaking around just where you are. So when we looked at risks in the last year or two, this was a reference point to say, how are we looking at this? And we need to be thinking around this really, really differently, especially productivity, and high impact risks and license to operate. Those 3 are kind of intermingled. So this was a starting point for us. Then the other thing that we also were acutely aware of, especially from roughly February, March last year. So if you were in South Africa, South Africa went into a lockdown around about March or so. In Botswana, it was literally like a month later. And then they went into pretty much a hardcore lockdown for extended periods of time. So if you were here in Botswana, you couldn't get out. There was a lot of discussion here around the mining sector, obviously being defined as an essential services. What does it mean in terms of how we operate? We went on a staggered approach around bringing staff in, reduced staff in terms of who can come to work, who can't. So the key thing with all of that is the considerations around our risk and future of work became really, really important. So all of these kind of things around, how do we think around a hybrid workforce? Are you interested in output, or are you interested in effort? Are you concerned around micromanaging people, or more on results orientated? Can those tasks be portable? If you were a support service like HR, finance, procurement? Could you sit off site and do your work? Did you need to be on site? So there's certain aspects that you could do remotely and others that you can't, because the nature of the mining operation is, probably for a good majority of our operations, we need to have people on site. And then also around looking at diversity, and equity and inclusion. So, previously, maybe, around people that were, in an unfortunate position that, let's say they were disabled or they were in wheelchairs and stuff like that. Now, all of a sudden, the nature of the work from home or future of work is, as long as that individual could deliver on the work, those particular limitations before are now no longer an issue. So what it does mean is you now potentially create more opportunity out there. And then what about IT strategy? So the key thing is how do you now work the business to have a view that everywhere where you are, the enterprise is, whether it's your laptop, your tablet, your cell phone, how do you do that? So these are all the things that came into obviously our space around that. So in terms of our emergent risks, I've kind of put them into 4 categories just from a reference point. To me, the people side is probably the most important. And I think the one that we kind of probably less focus on initially. And I think the key thing with, I think most organizations, you focus on the stuff that's easy to do. So you can redefine the process, you can reallocate certain tasks, you can change how do you bring people to site, how do you stagger shifts. So for us here with collectively probably permanent staff plus contractors, we have over 1,400 people on the mine site per day. So how do you manage that? How do you stagger it amidst the COVID conditions? So the biggest thing that we had identified really, really early on, so around about January, February, was that we needed to get a counselor on board. So that was really critical for us. So we already identified on that part around what do we do. So the mental wellness and mindfulness of the individuals was critical, and that became front and center for us. How do we manage that? A lot of people go through levels of anxiety, concern around the virus. What does it mean for them, their family, their colleagues, etc. So that became really important. And remember, not just for them, your significant other, your partner, during the COVID time, they were either placed on furlough in terms of people's jobs being placed on hold, and they'd be told to remain at home and not be paid. They might have lost their jobs, been retrenched. So that was a big thing on the people side. I'll go into the mitigation shortly. In business preparedness or business continuity was also a really, really big one, in terms of are we prepared for this? Do we know what we look like? How many supplies do we have? Do we have critical spares? Being in Botswana, as an example, a lot of our product comes from South Africa. So how do we get fuel? How do we get critical spares? How do we ensure we have stock online for the next 3-4 months in case we go into extended lockdown? That became a key thing for us. What about our data side of it? In terms of if people were working from home, what is the security like there? Are they utilizing secure networks? Are they utilizing hotspots? What about data there? They could have documentation lying around. And then about technology, how available is the technology? Is it accessible? Is it secure? So those were the 4 key ones that were top of mind for us. And I want to jump into the considerations, because obviously I'm conscious of time. But so I've got these 3, 4 that are here just for you as reference. So on the mental side, I spoke a little bit around this earlier, was we identified early on that we needed to get a dedicated, counselor on board. So in actual fact, we managed to get a great counselor, that actually was a trauma counselor with significant experience and knowledge around dealing with trauma. In fact, the counseling in question was unfortunately, they were in the USA during the time of 9/11. So they came with this real significant view around how to deal with people during potentially traumatic circumstances. So got the counselor on board. They provided us with so many hours per week where our staff could engage with the counselor, speak to them around stuff around understanding the COVID side of it, also understanding around how they're feeling, and this was extended to their family and even our contractors as well. And then beyond that, there was also additional aspects that we brought into play around our particular supervisors, heads of department, getting coaching around this is what's coming down. Are you aware of this? How do we, speak to our staff? How do we have either group sessions as departments or individual sessions? And the key thing was around continuous communication. So we established quite a lot of things in play in terms of the COVID task team, developed a COVID email kind of, group. We send messages on a regular basis. So we did a lot of stuff to kind of get the communication out there on a continuous basis, because the biggest thing around this was very few people knew what it's about. What is COVID? What does it mean? How do I pick it up? So it was really the early stages of what we know today is not what we knew, 12, 15 months ago. So it was a big drive around getting the people side right. I think once you started to calm the waters, people have a better understanding of it. You now had greater, I wouldn't say tranquility, but calmness around understanding. And I think that was really critical. On the business preparedness and continuity side, the big thing for us there was we were really fortunate in 2019. We did undertake a business continuity project where we already had looked at all of our processes and etc. So by the time it came to the actual COVID side of it, we had already gone really far down the track with business continuity planning, business continuity plans, business impact assessments. So our planning was really done. So as soon as we got to February and we knew what was coming down the line, we could really quickly go into our business continuity management toolkit. We could pull, these are our 176 suppliers. These are the guys that we have critical spares that's there. This is what they need to do for us. Do we have a lead time in terms of our stock? So we kind of already kind of foresaw what was coming down the line. So luckily for us, we always, in terms of the management of operations, we got generally like a 2-3 month of stock available. So it was really critical around that. We even extended training. Funny enough, even at the end of last year, November, December, we had a virtual crisis management training that was conducted here on site with our directors in Canada, our other MD and the staff there in Botswana on the call, and even guys from South Africa, and all of our crisis management champions here. So we had a virtual crisis management kind of almost simulation that happened in November, December amongst all of this, because we were actually in a good state of preparedness. And the key thing is it kind of blent itself to the testing, and this is a continuous process. On the data leakage and protection side, the biggest thing is all of our staff who do operate remotely, they have both obviously VPN in terms of ensuring that they're on a secure private network. That was a big driver. So the biggest thing for us was around ensuring that if people are operating remotely, they use the VPN to ensure that they can connect to that. So it's not going through a kind of a Wi-Fi hotspot somewhere on the side of the road or at a petrol station or at the airport. So the VPN was really, really critical. And obviously the antivirus protection, our IT guys are pretty good on that one. So it was a continuous around one, how do we ensure that we're aware of any of these viruses coming through, that our firewalls are up to date. So that was also a very significant ramp up. And ultimately cyber protection. So, that it's a continuous process. So that became a real key thing for us. And that's continuous as well. That, there was at the moment now we're going through a second drive of cyber awareness training for our staff around, don't click on a link if you see it, just being socially aware of what people can do, and also social engineering as well. And on the technology side was really around how do we ensure people that operate remotely that the technology is available, it's accessible, and it's secure. So things like licensing and updates and all of that become really important. So it was really around now all of a sudden you weren't just thinking around one thing, you're now thinking around, okay, how do I, as a CRO, also link in with the Chief Information Officer? How do I also link in with the IT team, what they're doing? How do I link in with the business continuity guys? So really for me was around looking at all of these collectively. So these were the primary ones that were coming through. And also remember the biggest thing around all of this is that, especially on the people side, there was so much uncertainty last year in terms of, where is this going to go, in terms of the virus, what does it mean around job security, job losses, and obviously you got all of these emergency, procedures coming through and regulations from governments that would dictate what you can and can't do. So there was high anxiety. So the biggest thing for us amongst all of this was continuing business as usual and keeping our staff calm. That was really the critical part. So, and again, just to kind of link into our philosophy as an organization, that the key thing is just that we never looked at risk management as it's something that Jonathan does, or the MD does or the GM does. It really permeated throughout the organization. So, and this again goes back to the comment I raised around risk culture. When I'm not here, I'm not in a meeting, does the risk conversation still continue? So this really is really important around for you and your organization is, where does that risk management responsibility lie? And yes, they might say that in terms of your job function and profile, you are the go-to person. But for me, the philosophy is, how does this get embedded? So I think that is a critical one for us, that, what I saw over the last 12, 18 months, this is now in play. So in terms of our adaptation to emerging risk, and again, I'm just speaking from a Botswana perspective, I can't comment around what happens, around other countries that landlock us. And to me, I think the biggest thing for us was that maybe it's around, they say chance favors a prepared mind. And I think the more you do, I think Gary Player said, the more I practice, the luckier I get. And I think to me, it's around the resilience part of it, is that the continuation around not sitting on your laurels. And I think already, at the end of probably November, December 2018, you kind of saw some activity in China, but you kind of weren't really sure where it was going to go at that stage. And I think January, February, you could just see. So I think already for us, we kind of, had that window of opportunity where we were in that sweet spot where we were continually looking at those key activities. So it really put us in an advanced position and very advantageous. And I think the adaptability or agility, I think, of Lucara at that time, I think really, is testimony, I think, to where we find ourselves now, that, we have a strong awareness. We continue in every day around, looking at our COVID protocols and where people are, and social distancing and thermal cameras and sanitizing and masks and all of that stuff. And it's continuous. And I'm sure a lot of people are going through COVID fatigue, and they probably have had enough of it and probably getting really frustrated. So for us, it's around trying to find creative ways, new ways to get people to understand things differently. So not to say, why aren't you wearing a mask? Say, well, why are you wearing a mask? What are you trying to do? Protect yourself, protect your family, protect your loved ones. So it's really trying to spin the conversation differently. So where we find ourselves, I think, as an organization, that I think we were rather, adaptable and agile, and I think it's helped us. And it doesn't mean that we kind of stop there and we kind of become complacent. So the big driver for us on everything we do is we cannot be complacent. Not daily, not weekly, every hour where we are, we have to be conscious of, is this okay? What is the risk? So for me, I think that's really the critical part around, I think, this overall view where we find ourselves. So really kind of to leave you with a concluding slide, I think the key thing where we find ourselves in the world at the moment is COVID is the new, or not so new, but it's the current, I suppose, the risk that's here, and it's definitely not the emerging one. I think this one has emerged already now. It's kind of old, right? We just having different versions of COVID now coming through. So the variant is the issue, and I think the emerging risks we may be not even fully aware of what's coming down the line. But I think we have to continue to have these conversations with each other. Whether it's with IRMSA or other professional bodies around. What's happening in your space? What about this? What are you seeing there? And often things that may not even be in our industry could impact us. So it's around not thinking in a siloed way around your business. So for me, I'm always encouraged to try and speak to people from different industries, different environments, because for me, it gives me a bit of a golden nugget to say, hey, that might be an interesting thing that could come down the line. And how do I factor this in? And how do I push information to my principles around, are you thinking around this? And especially where I'm sitting in the mining and metal space, there's a big driver around environmental, social, and governance space. So how do I continue to make them aware of that? We've got a strong driver on voluntary principles of security and human rights. So how do I continually ensure that the business is not at risk, and also that we can continue business, given the where we're sitting in terms of the diamond market. There's a bit of a turn there, it's looking stronger. So how do we ensure that we are in the best position to ensure the business is sustainable and viable? And ultimately, really the last point there is that we have to move into a position of acting. And I think a lot of people do lots of talking lots of times, and sometimes it's just often best just to keep quiet get the job done. Yeah, so hopefully that's given you some insights to where I find myself last year and where I find myself currently sitting on the mine here. And yes, that lovely picture behind me is the picture of the mine and where we are. So I'm not in my suits and jacket here. I'm in my PPE, ready to go where I'm needed to. So yeah, that's all on my side. Hopefully, I'll hand back to Millicent for any questions or comments. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Jonathan, for that insight into the emerging risk. And I think as much as you focused on Lucara and Botswana as a country, colleagues will agree that the presentation hits home irrespective of the type of industry that one is in, because you touched on the most important aspects, and actually to learn how you were managed to use risk management to make sure that the mine is still able to deliver in terms of its vision as well as its objectives. So just on a high level highlights from what I've picked up from the presentation is the issue of embedding risk culture across the company. That is very important, and I think that's one element that perhaps some institutions miss, where you find that the culture is, if there's no risk management professional or expert or employee, then we're not going to talk risk. And already that talks to the risk maturity that you also alluded to. That shows then a lack of understanding in the process that it should be, as they are risk owners, as they take decisions, they should already be thinking, okay, what can we be exposed to and how will we address it importantly? And what opportunities, if any, can we take from this? I've also noted importantly, the communication aspects that you alluded to, the relevance to the audience that you are talking to, something that we perhaps miss. You talked about the different audiences that you engage with, and how important it is to actually consider that before you just apply, I would call it an umbrella type of a view. And also now the top risk exposures that you've talked about. What interested me most is in your presentation, you've mentioned that with your top risks or emerging risks, you have seen a reduction in the risk exposure since last year, which already, if I understood correctly, then it means that you were able to enforce and make sure that the mitigating measures put in place were actually implemented and result. And another interesting factor was the focus of the company on people, on its people, the mental wellness and mindfulness focus. I think that is something that, coming from my side, in the different institutions that one serves in, it's lacking really. And the moment you do not take that much care for your people, they are your resources. You likely will not achieve what you want to achieve at the end. So that is something as well that I had taken note of. And generally the business resilience that you talked about, and avoiding of silos in terms of doing what you're doing. So Jonathan, I'm going to now check with the colleagues on the chat box. So far, there were no questions that were raised. There was just, I think, a reiteration of what I just mentioned, where one of the colleagues indicated that, risk conversations when you're not there is critical. And I also like the way you put it. What happens when you're not there? It's very important. And I see there's also another comment. Fantastic insights. Thank you, Jonathan, especially on the culture side with such practical advice. And colleagues, if there's anyone with questions, because I see on the chat box we do not have questions. And I believe, Jonathan, everyone is just amused like I am. They just absorbed all the information. That's why I'm saying this really hit home. There's a lot of things that I've just highlighted the top highlights, but there's a lot of things that I've noted that I'm like, wow, this can be considered for improvement in our own areas, because some of these things, it sounds easy, but we haven't even thought about them. So let's see if there's a question. Okay, so there's one question, Jonathan, and from Antonella, and she's saying, how do you propose to benchmark your risk culture and making sure it reinforces governance?
Yeah, so I think,
okay.
Yes, so I got that question. So I think on the risk culture side, so the risk management program that we started at around the end of 2019. So for me, in earnest, the team started kind of getting to grips with stuff, I'd say in kind of 2020. So for me, the way that I would look at the risk culture is that every department or area is going to go through a different level of maturity based on that individual's almost what I would say adoption rates of understanding. So for me, when I look at the culture side, I look at it probably in different ways. So I can do a survey that would go and get a view of it. But the way that I am doing, I would say, a risk culture view is because of my engagement with what I call the risk champions here. And we also have compliance champions and SHE champions, etc. But on the risk champion side and the business continuity champion side, I see the culture evolving because of my interaction with them, and also the quality of the information that comes out. So because I'm interacting with them on a monthly basis around looking at their environment and their risks and what their output is, I see the maturity of the content. In other words, I'm not just going to complete the risk register because, example, Jonathan is asking me to. I can see now that they're looking at the controls differently. They're looking at, is it a preventative control, a detective control? They're looking at the actual mitigating actions. I can start to see the discussions they're having. And beyond that, what I also then see is that every morning on the mine site here, it's a standard practice, but they have what we call toolbox talks. So when I start to see that in those toolbox talks, which are predominantly more SHE orientated, so let's be safe today, guys, let's not drop anything on our foot, let's make sure we've got the PPE. When I start to see in those toolbox talks, there's the risk conversation. So we're not talking around SHE, we're talking about risk. What is the risk to us in operation? Then I can start to see the maturity. So it's almost like there's an informal and a formal way of tracking it. And obviously at a point in time, so normally I would say by the end of this year or next year, I'll do a formalized, risk culture survey to those particular individuals and in the organization. So normally we have a people engagement culture survey that we drive through our HR or through our human capital department. So in that instance, I can then add 1 or 2 questions in there around the risk culture, and that'll give me some insight to it. But to do a particular risk culture for the guys up to 20 questions won't add value now because I'm on the ground with them. I can get that firsthand, and then we have feedback on a regular basis. So I think that's how we do it. So to me, I think probably by the end of the year, I'd look to do a formalized review. But in the interim, what I would do is I would kind of interrogate the data to get a sense of it. So hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, no, thank you so much. Antonella, I hope that answers your question. I also saw Kobus, you wanted to respond to the question as well, or to add on to the question. Roxanne, can you assist them, Kobus, in saying something along those lines? Roxanne? Okay, all right. It seems that is covered. So I
Are you on mute, Millicent?
Millicent, you're on mute.
It seems we have lost Millicent's audio there. So apologies for that. We will try and see if we can get Millicent back.
Can you hear me? Oh,
Perfect. Thank you, Millicent.
okay. Can you hear me now? Sorry.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm not sure what happened there. It's technology, and I'm not sure at what point I was missed. But Jonathan, thank you so much for this presentation, value adding, as I indicated, eye-opening, and we will definitely learn from it. And by the way, my earlier comments about introducing you as an expert, yes, that is correct. So colleagues, I see there are no longer questions or hands or anything. I would like to thank you so much for this insightful presentation. And Valerie, I'm not sure if then you would want to come back in to do the official closing of the presentation and the webinar, but thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for all the comments and everything. And you can then also respond, Val, on the presentation being shared. Thank you so much.
Of course, thank you, Millicent. Thank you for facilitating so well. And Jonathan, thank you so much for your insights. I think, one of the gems that actually came out of this session is that question of a test for your company is what are the risk conversations when you're not there? So, that's a challenge for everyone to take back to their organization. So Jonathan, thank you for an awesome presentation. And would we be able to share your slides with the attendees post the session?
Yes, that's fine, not a problem.
Perfect. Thank you, Jonathan. And thank you for participating.
Great, thank you very much for the opportunity.
So we've come to the end of our session, but before we go, just a couple of reminders of what's coming up in the IRMSA space is we are really excited for our annual conference coming up, and the events team and the creative team have really just started working on annual conference at the beginning of the year. So we are putting together a really great program, particularly for Africa. We will again have that dedicated stream for a spotlight on Africa and looking at the Africa landscape, and great conversations in that stream. So annual conference coming up on the 29th and 30th of September. And then, as you know, on the back end of that, on day 3, we have our annual masterclass where we get really creative and give you a really focused topic for that masterclass. And then looking ahead, we're sitting in May, but we're already halfway through the year. So I'm already looking that we're already in June. And so our awards nominations will be opening by the end of this month. So by Monday, you will see those awards nominations pop into your inbox. So what does that mean? So really those awards nominations is really just to celebrate and acknowledge the excellence in that risk space of individuals and organizations. So if you can already start thinking about who are those individuals that are really those shining stars and are driving those risk conversations in your organizations, to get those nominations through. And then in your organizations, what are those initiatives that really stand out, where risk management has really just enabled those processes. So really exciting things coming up. But thank you for joining us, and I hope you've enjoyed the conversations. We will be sharing this presentation with you, but please do reach out to us if you have any questions or comments, or if you need any interventions in your organizations. So stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you online soon, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.